Rome's greatest enemy wasn't foreign, it was itself. The foundations of Roman power, its politics, its armies, even its people, were its strength, the source of its dominance. But behind the scenes, those same forces were quietly tearing the Republic apart. How did a system that seemed built to last forever start to unravel? On today's episode of the Infographic Show, we're explaining the fall of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic officially began in 509 BC, when the Romans overthrew Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, a king said to be a cruel and arrogant ruler. In his place, they built a system of elected magistrates. All of the power firmly rested with 2 annually elected consuls and a senate composed entirely of patricians. Rome's hereditary elite, the oligarchs. The plebeians, Rome's common folk, had no voice at first, but centuries of protest forced the patricians to share power. By 367 BC, a pleb could even be a consul, and their new tribunes could veto laws that crushed the poor. Rome's genius was its balance. It had 2 consuls who could cancel each other's orders, a senate of 300 lifers who quietly ran the show, and citizen assemblies that passed laws and chose magistrates, at least in theory. In practice, the votes were stacked, so the rich spoke first and the rest hardly mattered. Censors ranked citizens by wealth and morals, deciding who paid taxes and who fought. The rich took the battlefield themselves, not out of necessity but ambition. It was a way to prove loyalty and earn power. Judges, accountants, and city officials filled the lower offices, all climbing toward the Senate. On paper, it was a perfect republic. Checks, balances, no tyrants. In reality, it was rigged for the few. And that tension would one day burn the republic to ashes. At the time, the once scrappy city-state of Rome was becoming filthy rich. Its wealth partly grew out of the acquisition of new territories and foreigners agreeing to pay money. The subjugated losers paid a kind of tax, a tributum or tribute, and sometimes the stipendium, an indemnity for the cost of Rome beating them up. The Romans liked their taxes. It was one reason they functioned so well as a power. They were organized, and with that money, they built a great society. The Romans displaced the Greeks as the hegemons of the Mediterranean. In the 3rd century BC, they marched into southern Italy and gained control of the Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. They lagged behind the Greeks in terms of culture, but they quickly absorbed their science, philosophy, art, and medicine. Military victories soon followed. Rome crushed the Macedonians, drove the Carthaginians from Europe, and finally sacked Carthage itself, extending its reach into North Africa. They were at constant war, their armies sacking city after city, leaving massacres in their wake and hauling off slaves. Women were sent to households, men to the fields and the mines, and educated Greeks would tutor children or entertain the aristocracy. For hundreds of years, they made their enemies bend the knee, and they learned from everyone they subdued. They'd seen how the Greek city-states had once fought amongst themselves, so they built a centralized system. Instead of separate rival cities, they united Italy under one government and shared a Roman identity. And their allies in war, or the vanquished, could hope that one day they would gain Roman citizenship. Where the Greeks had failed with their division and xenophobia, the Romans rewarded loyalty. They were pragmatic people, creating bureaucracy and infrastructure, developing laws and building a civil society that would outlast any one leader. It was a government designed to prevent the rise of tyrants. The Greeks might have inspired the world with their knowledge, but the Romans knew how to rule it. Rome had become a beacon of good rule. But with wealth came inequality. As its riches increased, so did its population. Most lived in squalor, while the elite retreated to vast estates that only grew larger. To ensure their privilege stayed intact, the corrupt bought votes, while officials at all levels could be bought with bribes. They developed laws to limit luxury and to stop the rich from buying all the best land, but with money came flexibility. The laws were abused or totally ignored. The land issue became a huge problem. Rome was an agrarian society. It had relied on farming for centuries to feed its people. But as it became more powerful and its shipping industry grew, it traded all over the Mediterranean. Then, as Rome won more territory, the wealthy bought slaves. Those slaves were sent to work on huge estates or in the mines. Family enterprises could no longer compete with farms owned by the elite. These plebeian farmers, for hundreds of years the backbone of the Republic, were now being pushed off of their land. The more money you had, the more slaves you could buy, and the bigger your business became. Senators weren't allowed to profit from commerce, but the equestrians, the class just below them, controlled Rome's business world, funneling profits upward whenever the laws favored them. There were trials for corruption, but with enough money, justice could be bought. Capitalism had driven remarkable progress in Rome, but it had also given birth to something darker: greed. Meanwhile, as the common man struggled to keep up, the moneylenders lent them cash at high interest rates. They just couldn't compete, especially when taxes were raised to fund yet another war. The governors of provinces collected taxes, but they kept a lot for themselves. It didn't help the plebs that fighting was often so far away. They hoped to return to their farms, but if war lasted as long as the Second Punic War, from 218 to 201 BC, it was almost hopeless to keep a farm going. And when they came back, elites might have just bought up all the land, their slaves grafting for free. According to the historian Plutarch, legislation was passed to prevent the elites from buying more than 500 acres, but the rich just paid bribes or found legal loopholes. The poor effectively became useless. There was so much free labor in Rome that the foreign-born slaves started to outnumber the plebs. It was almost impossible to find work. As more and more farmers became destitute, they left the fields and they went to the city, hoping to find work as casual laborers, maybe landing a gig building aqueducts, baths, or roads, to become craftsmen or entertainers, but not all could find work. Many had nothing at all, surviving on free grain. For women, especially if alone, it was almost impossible to survive. Rome was full of brothels, but prostitutes tended to be slaves or freed women. Still, when times were hard, female citizens could turn to selling their bodies, hoping that they were pretty enough to become high-class escorts. For men in a similar position, some turned to begging, gladiatorial fighting, bodyguarding, or in some cases, crime. Just as would happen in England many centuries later at the start of the Industrial Revolution, Rome's poorest ex-farmers amassed in filthy city slums. They lost faith in the system. They had always been told to follow the code of duty, modesty, and sacrifice. But what did they see? Poverty, desperation, and men in public service seemingly caring only about their personal enrichment. It was a recipe for social disaster. Pliny the Elder said it was destroying a great state, not just because its own citizens were suffering, but because Roman culture was being diluted. He said Romanness was dying. For him and many others, Romans were superior to outsiders, so more foreigners would surely lead to moral decline, but the truth was outsiders were making the wealthy money, so in they came. Politicians tried to quell discontent with the games. They put on shows of gladiatorial combat to take the people's minds off of poverty and corruption. Bread and circuses. It was around the time of the Punic Wars that these spectacles of violence became regular popular entertainment. Life was tough for the poor, but with free bread and regular, sanctioned brutality, many people failed to notice the vast inequality that they were now a part of. And if an elite put on more events, the more popular he became, and the more votes he acquired. As the dark streets at night became more dangerous, politicians surrounded themselves with gangs of personal bodyguards. And for the right price, these men would harass, kill, burn, or simply block the road to a VIP getting somewhere important. Publius Claudius Pulcher, tribune of the plebs, built an empire of street gangs, men who could intimidate, riot, or kill when needed. His mobs clashed constantly with those of Titus Annius Milo, a rival politician also hungry for power. Milo, a friend of the statesman Cicero, was eventually exiled after being charged with murdering Pulcher and later killed by a thrown stone while rebelling against Julius Caesar. That's just one example of how dangerous life was. So assaults, assassinations, and all-out gang warfare in the streets were now common. Senators were sometimes killed in broad daylight, and no one dared intervene as houses burned to the ground in the ensuing riots. In the Suburba district, Rome's main slum, thieves, pickpockets, muggers, and con artists made life miserable for the poor. As inequality worsened, so did crimes of poverty. There was so much wealth in Rome, yet ancient-style deaths of despair and people fighting over food or debts were all too common. There was no police force either. For everyone who couldn't afford protection, it was every man for himself. These destitute people became known as the proletari. They owned nothing or close to nothing. The only thing they could give to Rome was their children. They were exempt from military service but could be called upon in an emergency. They had very few voting rights but ranked just above slaves on the social ladder. Rome's streets were teeming with them. The city was at breaking point, and then the good republic gave way to all-out chaos. This is where the Gracchi brothers come into the story, Tiberius and Gaius, who didn't at all like what they were seeing in Rome. The eldest, Tiberius, was something of a hero to the people. During the Third Punic War, he was said to have been the first Roman to scale the walls of Carthage and lived to tell the tale. In politics, the brothers stood for the plebeians as members of the populares, progressive and at times violent activists who pushed for reforms to help Rome's growing poor. Today, the brothers are seen as either heroic Roman socialists or populist demagogues, Whatever the truth, they did a lot of good. Tiberius proposed land redistribution, legally taking some of the land away from the wealthy, many of them senators, and giving it back to the landless masses. And as history has shown, land distribution from elite to poor is a dangerous sport, and it certainly was for the Gracchi brothers. Both met violent ends. Tiberius in 133 BC killed alongside his followers, and Gaius in 121 BC choosing death himself rather than the fate his brother suffered, beaten to death with chairs. Like Tiberius, Gaius's followers were purged. Some accounts say 3,000 men were executed, but many of his reforms remained. Historians would later say that killing political enemies after that became a part of the system. If you couldn't beat them, kill them. Rome had always been violent, but now politicians were killing instead of debating. Cicero wrote that the death of Tiberius divided a united people into two distinct groups: the wealthy few who wanted to preserve the status quo and its power, and the poor who demanded fairer treatment. This gave rise to more populism. With an angry mass behind a politician, a man could rise through the ranks. Rome became polarized. The optimates saw themselves as guardians of tradition, law, and senatorial authority. Meanwhile, the populares saw themselves as champion of the commoner, fighting injustice. It's hard to say how many truly fought for the public good and how many acted out of self-interest. It was probably a bit of both. And one thing is for sure, the division would end badly. Meanwhile, Rome's grain outputs were being hit by droughts and plagues, and over in Sicily, a major source of grain, there was a revolt by slaves, the First Servile War. But thanks to the dead Gaius Gracchus, there was now state granaries that ensured that the poor could usually get food from state-owned stores. He also introduced more humane laws on military conscription, but then everything changed. Gaius Marius was a brilliant and ambitious general. In 107 BC, during the war against Jugurtha in North Africa, he introduced a set of reforms that would change Rome forever. He opened army recruitment to the landless poor, men who owned nothing but their heads. For the first time, the poorest citizens could serve in Rome's legions, a process historians now call proletarianization. It might sound progressive, and the soldiers certainly liked that Marius had their backs, but with that kind of loyalty, a general could amass a big following. And in Rome, big followings could spell trouble. The new soldiers no longer served the Republic out of civic duty. They served their commander. Marius equipped, trained, and paid them well. When they returned from campaigns, they looked to him, not the Senate, for land, pensions, and reward. So what had once been a citizen militia had become a professional standing army, and its allegiance was to the man who led it. Could that be abused? Sure, those men were fiercely loyal. After all, what had the soldiers of previous generations gotten when they'd returned to their farms? Slave-owning elites who had put them out of business, or slums in the city, and empty political promises. For centuries, the Romans had fought for territory all over Italy, and they eventually won. The deal was usually the smaller city-states could rule themselves, but the men had to back Rome on its military campaigns. Still, they weren't made citizens, even though Rome's legions now had more allies in their ranks than Romans. It was a recipe for disaster, and then disaster came. It's not certain whether they rebelled over citizenship. They might have just gotten tired of being in Rome's shadow. They were Italian, but their cultures were unique. The rebellions were quelled, and as part of the deal, a lot more Italians were made citizens of Rome. Publius Sulpicius Rufus, a tribune of the plebs with mobs as backup, was in favor of giving more outsiders citizenship. But making more men citizens meant profoundly changing the makeup of the electorate. In essence, it could change the outcome of elections, and elites weren't keen on that idea. The fighting brought Rome thousands of new citizens, but it also tore through Italy on every front, forcing the Republic to raise massive armies. One of Rome's commanders was Lucius Cornelius Sulla Felix, known simply as Sulla, a brilliant general from a patrician family in decline. He served under the great Marius and was now about to make his own name in the East, fighting King Mithridates VI of Pontus. Part Greek, part Iranian, Mithridates was powerful and utterly ruthless. He had just massacred tens of thousands of Romans. Defeating him would rank among Rome's greatest triumphs, and it could make Sulla rich, famous, and immortal in history. When he was chosen by the Senate to lead the campaign, Marius, old but still hungry for glory, used his political allies to have the command transferred to himself. He had the help of Sulpicius Rufus after he had promised to back Sulpicius's controversial citizenship bill. As you can imagine, Sulla was not impressed. He was going to miss out on a lot of money, and in Rome it was looking like Marius and Sulpicius were engaging in a populist power grab. That bill, which the Senate opposed, would take voting power away from the old elite families. So these elites figured that they could use Sulla to make things right. Meanwhile, Sulpicius's mobs and Sulla's supporters rioted in the streets, furious at being kicked to the sidelines, and now with elite backing, Sulla did something no Roman general had ever done. He turned his legions from southern Italy toward Rome itself. Why not? He had the manpower. They marched on the city, making short shrift of anyone who stood in their way. No one had expected this. Marius didn't have troops in the city. It was easy for Sulla. Marius fled, but one day he would be back. Rome was imploding from corruption and inequality, and now there was a military coup. The Great Republic was not looking in good shape at all. Once a place that prided itself on laws and civic virtue, it was in chaos and ruled by force of arms. Sulla declared Marius, Sulpicius, and their many supporters enemies of the state, and took control of the city. He told people that he wasn't a tyrant, he was doing it for order. He knew what was good for them, and no one dared oppose him. The Senate approved a list of 12 people, the hosts, foreign enemies, to be murdered and their property seized. Sulpicius and Marius were at the top of the list. The rest were all tribunes except for one patrician. Most of them ran to Spain or as far as Africa, and Sulla sent bounty hunters after them. This was what democracy had turned into, entrenched elites fighting against populist reformers. But what Sulla had done set a really bad precedent in terms of how to govern. While Sulla fought Mithridates in the east, Marius slipped back into Rome, unleashing another round of killings and revenge. When Sulla finally returned, the city was soaked in blood, and Marius was gone. Again. To restore order, Sulla appointed himself dictator, but not for the traditional 6 months, he said indefinitely. His solution to political opposition was simple but effective: terror. He published lists of his enemies, and anyone named on them could be killed on sight. Their property seized and their families ruined. Thousands died, and many others enriched themselves by turning in former friends and rivals. Sulla had his men nail notices on the walls with all the names, with huge rewards for anyone who brought him heads. He even promised freedom to slaves who murdered their wanted masters. He beheaded a few himself the old way with an axe, and at times he had their bodies mutilated and dragged through the streets. Meanwhile, helping the wanted men was punishable by death, and in Rome that usually meant something slow and public. So some chose what in this case really was the easy way out. Sulla's closest allies were handsomely rewarded, including his young general Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, or Pompey, who did some of the hunting. A provident tactic because his family had once been allies of Marius. You'll be hearing more about Pompey soon. Like Adolf Hitler thousands of years later, Sulla claimed that he was saving the Republic by restoring order, the old-fashioned way, brute force. But the truth was his dictatorship destroyed the rule of law. He showed that power no longer came from laws or elections, it came from whoever had the biggest army. When Sulla died in 78 BC, he left behind a republic that looked restored on paper, but it was rotten inside. His reforms had strengthened the Senate and silenced the tribunes, but the cost was a landfill of resentment waiting to explode. Into this cauldron of bitterness stepped another man who promised to make things better: Marcus Aemilius Lepidus, one of Sulla's former allies who had suddenly discovered his conscience, or more likely his ambition. As consul, Lepidus called for reversing Sulla's reforms, returning confiscated lands, and restoring full power to the tribunes of the plebs. He claimed to be defending the people's rights, but in truth he was rolling the dice. With the public behind him, he thought that he could become the new strongman of Rome. The Senate didn't buy it for a second. They branded him a traitor, and civil war broke out again. Lepidus's army in Etruria was defeated by Pompey, or Pompey the Great as he'd become known. Lepidus fled north and died soon after. Rome was still a mess, but now Pompey was a national hero, a savior of Rome, another one. He had to figure out how to restore order, so he turned to what historians often call the richest man in Rome, Marcus Licinius Crassus. He'd been a general under Sulla and done very well for himself while Sulla was dictator, especially as a property speculator buying up the estates of the unlucky proscribed. But Crassus was ambitious too, and he certainly made a name for himself. It was him who led armies against Spartacus in the Third Servile War, and he was ruthless, lining the Appian Way with 6,000 crucified slaves. The rebels had once been gladiators, training tens of thousands of men to fight Rome, and for a time they even won. But Crassus triumphed. To the people, he was a hero. By today's standards, a billionaire who could fight. Now Rome had two heroes, Crassus and Pompey, and they didn't get along. Pompey had helped end the slave revolt when his legions arrived and made the rebels scatter, but it was Crassus's men who did all the hard fighting. When both he and Pompey arrived back in Rome, they wanted rewards and positions of high office. In 70 BC, they were both elected co-consuls, restoring the power of the tribunes and reforming the courts. The Senate didn't like it, but it was too weak to do anything about it. And there was another player in this game of power politics who'd made a name for himself: Julius Caesar. Super ambitious, eloquent, and fearless, he was becoming the campaigner of campaigners, who was good to his men and in return demanded fierce loyalty. In Rome, it worked two ways. A commander who subjugated foreigners and brought riches and glory to Rome was supported. Rome was nothing without these men. But the stronger they became, they turned into a threat, all because of Marius and his reforms. Caesar was born to nobles, but his family wasn't very wealthy. However, his aunt Julia was married to Marius. The Caesars were in the populares camp rather than the aristocratic optimates. And that wasn't ideal for a young man, since Sulla was in the middle of his purges. But Caesar was just a teenager, not yet important enough to draw Sulla's attention. Then he married Cornelia, the daughter of Lucius Cornelius Cinna, one of Marius's closest allies. Sulla wasn't happy telling Caesar divorce her or die. He chose option number 3, run. His property was taken, but it seems that Sulla later softened, saying, let him live. Caesar, he warned, was another Marius in the making. After Sulla died, Caesar returned to Rome and made a name for himself after being captured by pirates and telling them they needed to increase the ransom. He later hunted them down and had them crucified, but because he was a nice guy, he slit their throats first. He became a man of the people, and to cut a long story short, he teamed up with Pompey and Crassus in a secret political alliance now known as the First Triumvirate, and that would give them power over the Senate. By the late 60s, Rome was fracturing again. The Senate was paralyzed by the usual infighting, while ambitious generals were out in the provinces building reputations and armies. Pompey had returned from the east a hero, but hadn't gotten what he wanted from the Senate, including rewards for his veterans and new laws on provincial administration and tax collection. Crassus wanted debt relief laws for his clients, but he couldn't get them either. And Caesar, well, he wanted to climb higher up the slippery pole of Roman power. But without cash or strong family connections, he needed powerful allies. And there was no one stronger than Crassus and Pompey. These three men weren't exactly ideal partners. They simply had mutual interests, and their alliance would help them get what they wanted. Caesar would become consul and push through Pompey's laws and Crassus's economic reforms, and in return they would finance and support his military career. Again, Rome was looking like it was ruled by strong men. The Republic wasn't being governed anymore, it was being divided up like loot. The Senate had become almost a spectator. Rome's fate now lay in the hands of generals and billionaires. Over the years, Caesar's victory in Gaul made him a legend. He crushed powerful tribes and even crossed the sea to the land we now call Great Britain. Centuries later, the Romans would go farther north still to Yorkshire, where they would build Hadrian's Wall to keep out the tribes of what is now Scotland. Caesar wasn't successful in gaining lasting territory in Britain, but the fact that he had taken his legions there at all was still impressive. The first landing in 55 BC, he barely even escaped alive, but the second time a year later he returned with more men and even an armored war elephant. He beat several tribes in battle and secured grain, slaves, and yearly tributes to Rome. Caesar was celebrated at home. He had written about new lands, new peoples, new technologies that could bring glory to Rome. He came, he saw, and he conquered. He now gained territory in today's France, Germany, Switzerland, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, Britain, and northern Italy. Historians might not agree on his victories, but a rough estimate is that he fought against 3 million men from various tribes, a third of which were killed and a third enslaved. The claim, disputed, is that he and his men took 800 cities and a total of 300 different tribes. To say he was admired by the Roman people would be an understatement, but with power comes great resentment. While he was conquering Gaul, Rome was in the process of tearing itself apart. The first triumvirate was in tatters. Crassus wanted all the glory for himself. He made the very rash decision to take on the Parthian Empire in his role as governor of Syria. But the Parthians were no pushover, and Crassus was no Caesar or Pompey when it came to leading legions. The upshot was a disaster. His army was annihilated at the Battle of Carrhae, one of Rome's worst defeats. With Crassus gone, the triumvirate was torn apart. Pompey himself, a military genius, didn't much like watching Caesar become the Roman people's top influencer. The Senate was whispering again, and soon they agreed Pompey would save the Republic, and in doing so their own interests. Pompey had married Caesar's daughter, Julia, which had strengthened their alliance, but she died in childbirth, so that fragile bond was gone. It was a bold move, but the Senate agreed that Caesar needed to be reined in. As politicians gave the order, the streets of Rome lit up with riots. Caesar had a lot of support in politics and certainly among the people, so the Senate quickly appointed Pompey as sole consul, making him a dictator in all but name. He marched his soldiers into the city and put down the riots. Once again, the rule of law was enforced by violence, not debate or votes. Pompey then used his new position to pass laws curbing Caesar's power and demanded that he disband his army and return to Rome. For Caesar, that looked a lot like a death sentence. He refused and was declared an enemy of the state. But this was Caesar we're talking about, a man who had conquered a good part of Europe. The die was cast, he said. Heads would roll. On January 10, 49 BC, a moment that changed history took place. Caesar and his army marched across the Rubicon River in present-day northern Italy. He took only one legion, Legio XIII Gemina, but it was one of his best. He didn't want a civil war, and neither did Pompey nor many of the nobles, but Caesar was caught between a rock and a hard place. The nobility had turned against him, and Rome was one big swamp of corruption. He had tried to negotiate, asking for the bare minimum guarantees to protect himself, but they refused. What choice did he really have? Members of the Senate ran in fear as Caesar marched on Rome, as did Pompey and his army, not confident in their ability to fight back. What followed was a relentless chase ending in Pompey's defeat and desperate escape to Egypt. There, King Ptolemy XIII, Cleopatra's brother, had him killed and sent Caesar his severed head as a gift. It backfired. Caesar was enraged and planned for war. Back in Rome, Caesar did the unthinkable. He forgave most of the men who had gone against him, including the politician Marcus Junius Brutus. With his ally Mark Antony in charge, Caesar went to Egypt and defeated the Alexandrians. He installed Cleopatra and her younger brother onto the throne. In many ways, he was progressive and the people loved him. But this was Rome, so of course, Caesar cemented his power by bending the rules. He packed the Senate with new members loyal to him and put term limits on governorships. He was starting to look like a dictator. Then he weakened the tribunes, which was not exactly a man of the people move. And at a fertility festival called Lupercalia during the celebrations, Mark Antony placed a crown on his head, saying, "The people give this to you through me." Dozens of senators agreed he had to be stopped. And it would happen on March 15th, the Ides of March, a date that for the Romans was often reserved for paying debts. When the big day came, the senators and their allies gathered at the Theater of Pompey, where the Senate was meeting that day. They waited and they waited, but Caesar didn't come. The reason could be legend, but it's said that his wife Calpurnia woke that morning after a nightmare in which he had been murdered and begged him not to go. But one of Caesar's closest friends told him to ignore the omens and walk into the Senate. Antony followed him and the others to the meeting, but as soon as they entered, someone grabbed Antony and shoved him into another room. Caesar, unaware, took his seat and was handed a petition to review. Around him stood men he believed were colleagues, but they were conspirators, daggers hidden beneath their togas. It was Senator Tullius Cimber who made the first move, grabbing Caesar's toga and pulling it down. Caesar shouted, "Why, this is violence!" Then Casca struck, driving his dagger into Caesar's neck. Caesar grabbed him and said, "Casca, you villain, what are you doing?" Then they all piled in, about 60 of them, including Brutus, a man Caesar had loved like a son. It was stab after stab after stab, 23 wounds in total. Some say his last words as he looked up at Brutus were, "You too, child." As Caesar lay in his own blood, the conspirators walked through the streets shouting, "People of Rome, we are once again free." But instead of cheers, they got fists. Buildings burning, people were killed, and the Republic's fate again slid into bloody chaos. Soon a second triumvirate filled the power vacuum. Mark Antony, Lepidus, and Caesar's great-nephew Octavian. Together, they defeated the conspirators and their allies and divided the Roman Republic amongst themselves. That friendship didn't last long. Antony, who had fallen in love with Cleopatra, found himself at war with Octavian. After losing the Battle of Actium in 30 BC, he died in Cleopatra's arms, while she, according to legend, died from one of her own snakes, although some historians believe she took poison. Lepidus was exiled after trying to seize power for himself, leaving Octavian as Rome's supreme leader for life. The Republic was well and truly over. Any form of democracy was gone. Rome had become an empire, and Octavian, now Augustus Caesar, would rule it all. Looking back, democracy had started well in Rome, but then turned into a great big failure. The empire's early years were golden. 2 centuries of peace, wealth, and expansion. The killing stopped, the cities boomed, and Rome stretched all the way to Britain. But then came the age of tyrants such as Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, and Nero. Rome had 70 million people at one point, a third of the global population. It was the center of the earth, a wonder of the world. And then came the decline, the chaos, the barbarian hordes who had taken advantage of the internal strife. Roman democracy had the potential to be humanity's greatest achievement. Instead, the rich hoarded power, the poor were forgotten, and the people tore each other apart, blinded by ideology and led by corrupt ambition. It began with inequality, and when inequality grows, when despair and violence spread, even the greatest nations crumble. Understanding the fall of the Roman Republic shows how history repeats itself. But one moment defined the end of it all. Watch what actually happened the day Julius Caesar was assassinated to see how Rome's greatest leader met his fate, or click on this video instead.